All right, squad, today I'm going to show you how we can deploy a Rails app to our custom infra hosted in AWS. So this is a good alternative to things like Heroku or Railway, where you're leasing hardware with a fee on top. So you're probably paying a little bit more and you have less control. So if you ever wanted to migrate away from those platforms, it could be a little bit harder. So what we're going to look at is Flightcontrol. And they offer quite a cool little utility here where you can actually deploy using their systems and their code, but onto your own AWS hardware, which means you control the hardware, you pay the bill directly to AWS, and they just add a small portion on top. So that in long term just means that your bills are way cheaper. So let's jump in and have a look how we do it. Okay, so you can see here, this is their website. So it's flightcontrol.dev. So basically using AWS without having to know AWS completely. So you don't have to know how all the services tie together, what the best practices are. Just makes things a lot easier, and it's what you would inherit from other platforms like Heroku. So it's quite simple to get started. So just create yourself an account. And then once you're in, you'll be given a dashboard like this. So before we create our project in here, what I'm gonna do is we'll create a new Rails app so that we can set up the basic functionality, and then we can move on from there. First things first, we are going to create ourselves a new Rails app. So to do that, make sure we have Rails installed. You can watch the other video on my channel. But we're going to go Rails new, and then we're going to call it Rails deploy. And we're going to use the database. We're going to use PostgreSQL. All right. Going to let that do its thing. Once it's installed, let's jump into that folder. So we're going to go cd into Rails deploy, which is the name we gave the app. And then we just run VS Code. So now inside of our brand new Rails app, we're going to need to do a few things to get started. So the first thing that we want to do is we're going to add Sidekick. The only reason I'm doing this is just to show how you can, in Flightcontrol, you can actually deploy multiple services at once. So we're not actually going to utilize Sidekick in this demo, but we're just going to add it so that we can show how it's done. And then inside of our gem file, we're going to find the Redis gem here, and we're going to uncomment that because we actually do need Redis to use Sidekick. So we're going to run bundle again. All right, the next piece is, let's go into our config database and just have a look here. So we can see that for development, we're using the Rails deploy. So it's got the name of our app and then development. And then we've got the test one here, and then the production's we'll grab it from here. So to set up our actual database now locally, what we're going to run is Rails DB prepare. And what that does is actually sets up our database for us. So if I run Valentina now, we can have a look now that we have Rails deploy development and development test, right? So that database has been set up, ready to go. So what we need to do now is we need to set up our secret key base, and Rails uses to encrypt certain things when it's working with it. So we're going to run this command here. So it's this editor part here is just saying we're going to use VS Code, and we're waiting for this to run. And then we're going to use Rails credentials edit environment production. So the credentials files is where we can store things that you would usually store in environment variables, but by using the credentials, it's encrypted, and it can be actually committed along with our code, because you need the key to decrypt. All right, so now what you can see here, here's a secret key base. It's already generated for us, and that's now ready to go. So we can just close that out. And what you can see that command would add, what it does is in the credentials file, it creates a production key, which is, you can see it's grayed out because it's not going to be committed to our repo. So never commit those, because you need that to read this. So we can safely commit this encrypted file here. No one can read it. And then we can share this key to who needs it. So most of the time, this will just be a few people in your team. And then this master key here can also be shared around if you need as well. And then you can also create credentials for development. So you can share the development key in your team. But we never commit these to our repos. The next thing that we need to do is we are going to now scaffold, just so that we have something that we can actually see in our app. We're going to run Rails G scaffold project. So it's going to set up the project model, the controller, the routes, the views, etc. And we're going to have a parameter called title, which is a string, and description, which is text. So we're going to run that. Now what you'll see is inside of our migrations, we're going to have now a new migration running here, all ready to be run, which is going to create a new table and add these two things and timestamps. And it also creates our controller in here. It's also created our model in here. So it's done all the work for us. All we need to do is run Rails db migrate. All right, so now what you can see is we have our new database here and we have projects here ready to go. What we can also just quickly check is inside of our config routes file, we're now going to, we can actually set our root here to projects index. So that means that when we run without any path, we'll get straight to our projects file. So if we run Rails S now in the command line, we're going to boot up our server. So you can see from scaffolding, we now have our basic Rails app here. We can create a new project. So we go test project. And we can create it. Go back, we've got our list. We can say another project. Test, create, awesome. There's our base, really cool web app that we've built with Rails in 2 seconds. So the next part of the puzzle is we're going to set up this flight control file. So let's just jump back into flight control and see how we can set up the project. The next step is we need to add our repo that we've just created. So we go Rails deploy, open that up. And now what we're going to do is we're going to commit all our code here. So we just call it initial commit. I'm going to commit that. So what we'll do now is just publish this repo. No, keep this code private. No, Rails deploy, publish. So now we push that to GitHub. Let it do its thing. Okay, so let's jump into flight control. Let's just quickly do a sanity check and make sure that it's actually there. Repos, Rails deploy, that's just come through. All right, so now inside of flight control, let's create a project. Look for Rails deploy. Main, Rails deploy production. Now, what you need to do is set up your AWS account. So that's quite simple. You just hit add AWS account, and then you can follow this open AWS authorization page. So that will step you through the process there. I've already done that, so I'm just going to select Kangaroo Personal, and my region is going to be Sydney, Australia. I'm going to hit next. Now we're going to say Rails setup. And then it's got services. Now this step here, I want to store this config as a file in my repository. I like having control over that. So I'm going to hit that. Now it's going to say download this file and put it in the root path. So we need to go from here and put that file in here. So it'll be called flightcontrol.json. So let's create that new file. Flightcontrol.json. All right, and then I'm going to copy paste one that I prepared earlier. Okay, all right, so let's have a quick look at this flightcontrol.json file. So at the top, we're just defining the schema, and then inside here, it's quite cool. We've got environment. So for us, it's the main one we're concerned with right now is a production environment, but you can have staging, you could have preview, you could have whatever you need it to have. So if you just collapse that, so give it an ID, name, the region we want it in, the source, and then the services. So this is an important piece. So we have multiple services in here. So the first one is the Rails app itself. So this is, think of this as your app server, the one that gets the web requests and processes them. Then you can assign your CPU and memory. So it's very cool. So you can control all the things that you would normally do in much more complex setups, quite simply here. You can set your min and max instances. So like if you want to scale up and down, obviously for a small app, we don't need to do that. We can set up install command. So this is when the actual service is installed initially, and then here's the build command. So you will notice I've got that migrate here, which is not best practice, because imagine if you had 10 of these spool up, you're gonna run db migrate 10 times, but they are working on a way to have a hook, so we can just run that once. And then we're pre-compiling our assets, defining our Docker file, and then our auto-scaling thresholds, which is cool. And then you can see we're using Fargate, which is the AWS service, and there's the health path to check. All right, so Rails now has, in 7.1, actually has a special built-in notification path, which is /up. There we go. So we can set that to there, just for now, we could say up. And then we can set the port that it's gonna run on, okay? Secondly, we have our Sidekick worker. So we're actually setting up a worker, a group of worker servers. So this is to execute background jobs on. And you can see that our start command is bundle exec Sidekick, right? So that's why we need to install the Sidekick gem there. And giving it a CPU. Again, you can have this scale as needed. Very cool. Now we have our database. So it's an RDS database, and we can define the size, storage, max storage, etc. And then the connection string environment variable name. And this is important because Rails actually will look for this environment variable first to see where the database is, and then what port we're running and what engine version, etc. And then finally, we have the Redis service, so the Elastic Cache service. And we use this, Sidekick uses this to queue jobs or to pull jobs from. Rails uses it to queue, and then Sidekick consumes. All right, so that is the basics of that file. It's it's quite simple to understand, but very powerful at the same time. But that's kind of all the config that we need to do here. So now that we've committed that file, we can just say create flightcontrol.json, commit it to main, and push that up. Now, you'll see here in flight control, it's looking for, and then boom, found it. All right, so now that it's found it, we can hit create project. Now that's gonna do its thing and start provisioning all the hardware. So as per any service, this will take some time because it's actually talking with AWS and building all the different pieces of hardware that we need, or assigning it, provisioning it. When this is done, this will take some time because it is a slow process whenever we do this for the first time. So we'll let this run. This should take anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes, but I'll jump back when it's done. So a few seconds in, you can see here the 4 services that we defined in our file are all busy being provisioned. Now, one thing that did catch me was when you click on this, this is actually the application running once it's all done. Where you want to look is here in deployments. When you click on this, you get a bit more detail on each thing and what's happening. So you get like the step that it's up to, build the steps, deploying steps, and success steps. The one thing I want to highlight about Flight Control, which is really cool, is they're actually using AWS tools to perform all of these things. So like when you'll see things like clusters, so I'm inside of my AWS account now, you can see the clusters are being created inside of AWS ECS, which is Elastic Container Service. And you can see it's using Fargate here. So everything's being built inside of AWS, which makes it really cool because you can actually go and trace back. So they use, I believe, code build here. So we can actually go into code build and you can see each project being built, right? So when things come in, you can see the build history and you can see things actually happening. So you can see certain things took 6 minutes 27 to build the Rails app. So because it's using AWS and it's inside of our own account, we can actually have transparency with all of these things. We can actually look at the logs, see everything that's happening. So there's a lot of visibility you gain because it's inside of our own account. Okay, so what will happen after quite a while, 23 minutes, is you will see this happen. Argument missing secret key base. Now we know we've set this value, but because we haven't given the key, you can't read it. So nothing can read this. So what we need to do here inside of Flight Control is go to environment settings, environment variables, and we're going to add some new ones. So we need to set the Rails master key and we need to set the Rails end. So the env is going to be production. And then from here, it's all right, you guys, I'm going to show the key because it doesn't really matter. So we're going to use the production key. We're going to grab this value and we're going to shove that in there. All right. Now we're going to deploy these changes before. So we'll just hit that and we hit save. All right. So we leave that tick there. So that's going to actually go and redeploy now with those settings there, with those environment variables. And the cool thing is, and again, using our own hardware, we can go to the parameter store here in AWS, and we can actually see, so the 23rd, you can see here that these environment variables are set. So if we could click on this one, we can show that and see the value. So it's storing those environment variables encrypted inside AWS, but we can see them right here. So that's one of the really cool things I like about this, is everything's visible. We can actually have access to everything we need. So that means if you ever need to like kind of deviate away from the standard, you can actually still access these things inside AWS. So for instance, RDS, imagine there wasn't a configuration that they'd set. If we just jumped in here, we can actually have a look and see the database running and make any changes we needed to. If config wasn't available inside of Flightcontrol, obviously do it there if you can. Keeps everything in sync, but if we needed to deviate just for a short term while something was still coming, or there's a brand new feature we wanted to use or upgrade, we could do this right in here. One thing to note is that when we are finished with this, we will destroy the project, which is really important so you don't keep getting charged for running it. But I do have deletion protection set to true, because if you are deploying something to production, you definitely don't want to be able to delete your database. So you want to manually delete it if you ever needed to. If you're just mucking around, you can leave this as false, and then when you tear down the project, it will be deleted. But for good practice, just to prevent a lot of pain, I have this set to true so that we can't accidentally ever delete a production database. Now that this build has completed, you can see it's successful here. You can see everything is finished. We can now have our logs. Hopefully they're running. Here we go. Now if we jump into, you can see here there's a little CloudFront URL here. So if we could use route 53 to point straight to this with our domain, if we click on it, boom, there's our Rails app. Now if we hit new project, we can say test project, test, create, back to project, new project, another project, test, create, and now we have two projects, delete, boom, and that's it. So that's how simple it is now to actually deploy a Rails application onto your own hardware in AWS, which is really cool, and something that I've been looking for a while, because I always like the idea that we can navigate away from a tool if one becomes deprecated or unsupported or shuts down. By using something like Flightcontrol, you don't have a problem, because it means we own our hardware. It's sitting here, it's sitting in AWS. We decide we don't need to use Flightcontrol anymore. There's no problem. Everything just keeps moving. All of our stuff, like you can jump into CloudFront, and it's a simple way to get into AWS before fully needing to understand how everything works. So they're going to set this project up with the best practices. So here you can see the D2U5. So there we go. That's our CloudFront distribution. And we can see here, and then you can actually look at how all of this stuff works and how it's been set up. And you don't have to, worry about knowing this beforehand when you just want to get up and running quickly. So I highly suggest having a look at Flightcontrol. It's a tool that I've been waiting for a long time. You can see it's exposing our logs right here. It just makes debugging way easier. They've even got like a little bit of a cost estimation here, so you can like watch how much you're spending. And then when it's all said and done and you're all happy that everything's running, you can simply just click here in environment settings, go to the danger zone, and you just say delete entire project, Rails deploy, hit destroy, And now what that's going to do is going to tear down all that infra. You don't have to worry about paying for it anymore. Just make sure you do that, otherwise you will get pinged with a bit of a bill. But we are using very small instances, so it won't be too expensive. But hopefully you enjoyed that one, and I'm definitely going to be using this moving forward. I've been looking for a solution for a long time, and I feel like this is the one for me. So I'll catch you on the next one.